bit into adornment today just to save some time tomorrow. If I can say this, that we will conclude this section of teaching tomorrow with some talk about 1 Corinthians 11 and ladies and their hair, which is given to them as a glory by God. It's an amazing, amazing thing. It's an amazing doctrine, and God always moves when that part of Scripture is taught. It's amazing. Let's go to number 6, apostolic admonitions in the New Testament. Now, we've been talking about the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 22:5, and creation, the fall of man, what happened in the Garden of Eden. But now we're going to go into the New Testament, and some people think, well, I'm under the New Testament, the New Covenant now, so I don't have to worry about that. That's all Old Testament. Oh, no, it's not. In the New Testament, it gets even more explicit. It's now explicit, direct teaching, more specific. There are 2 passages. We've read one a couple of times. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8. I will, therefore, that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also, the women adorn themselves in modest apparel. Everyone say apparel. With shamefacedness and sobriety. Everyone say attitude. Not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. And then we could split up the word apparel and modest, and we could say adornment, or we could talk about gold and pearls and costly array and say adornment. There are really 3 holiness issues in there. Apparel, attitude of submission, shamefacedness and sobriety, and adornment, gold and pearls and costly array. So that's not how women are supposed to adorn themselves. They are supposed to adorn themselves, like verse 10, with good works. And then he says, let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. And he goes on to talk about that. And we will talk about that in our session tomorrow. Let's go, though, to right now to 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, remember this. Paul writes to the Gentiles. Peter writes to the Jews. Paul is writing to the church. Peter is writing to wives in the privacy of their own home in relationship to their husband. And would you please notice this, that the standards across different cultures in the New Testament church were identical. Paul is writing mostly to people that are non-Jewish that have come into the Christian faith. Peter's writing mostly to Jewish people that have come into the Christian faith. But the standards of righteousness and holiness and godliness and even dress code are basically the same. Look at this. This is 1 Peter 3. Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may also without the word be won by the conversation or the lifestyle of the wives. So what Peter is saying here is, wives, if your husband is not saved, he can be won by your lifestyle. He'll behold your godly, modest lifestyle. Look at this, verse 2. While they behold your chaste lifestyle coupled with reverence, chaste conversation coupled with fear. Whose adorning? Let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair, wearing of gold, or putting on of apparel. Look at that. Hair and adornment and apparel. Same standards. Peter's writing to the Jews. Paul's writing to the Gentile Christians. But they have the same standards. But he says it the same, very similar way. Verse 4. But let her adorning be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. Would you please notice with me that Peter and Paul have the same standards for different segments of the church, different cultures in the church, because these are not cultural things. These are God's standards. And so this is really critical. Don't give me this thing, well, it was easier for them. It was not easier for them. The Roman Empire was the most corrupt empire on the face of the globe. It was an empire of decadence and debauchery and sensuality and unbridled sexuality. They had a hard time living for God in that culture. They had political persecution. They had all of the worst, and they still lived for God, and they still had a standard of modesty. They still had a standard of holiness and godliness. And in the Roman world, they had the slaves, but then they had the upper class kind of, and those upper class women, because women even in rich homes were not considered they weren't considered equal to men. They were considered more like a trophy wife, property. And so they spent much of their time, they didn't receive education. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to do many of the things that men did. They couldn't work outside the home. They couldn't hold public office. They couldn't do anything like that. So do you know what those women did most of the time while their slaves did all the work? They spent time beautifying themselves. And they did extreme things. They wore extreme cosmetics, and they would pile their hair high and weave gold in it and all kinds of stuff. And they had way too much time, I think, is what they had. But that's what they did. And it's in that context that the apostolic women are called to live out their faith. And you know what they do? They adorn themselves modestly. They don't follow the extremes of the Roman culture. They don't follow the extremes of decadence and sensuality. They dress modestly. And so Paul says that a woman's clothing needs to be 4 things. Number 1, it needs to be modest. And the word there, modest, means orderly. And that means something a little bit different than the way we would translate it today. The Greek word kosmios means well-ordered or becoming or dignified. And it describes someone who has inner discipline, and it's reflected in appropriate attire. Because Paul knew that the way a woman dresses tells everybody around her what is in her mind. And you can't tell me any different. Men know that instinctively, that the way a woman dresses is telling that man and everybody else around her what's in her mind. And if she dresses sensually, it's telling them something about her. What a woman wears doesn't just reflect her morals, it affects her morals. It affects her conduct. And so appropriate dress encourages a woman to act appropriately. And so Paul says, dress orderly, dress decently, dress becomingly. And so I would just stop just for a second and say, there's no merit by dressing disorderly. Women are supposed to look beautiful and to present themselves well and look classy. There's nothing wrong with that. Thank God our women are the most beautiful women on the face of the earth. They're godly, they're beautiful. Their beauty is not only external, but it comes from the inside. And so Paul says, you know, you don't have to, well, I'm a godly woman, so I'm not going to comb my hair. Well, yeah, right. That's not godly. That's just a mess. So it's not to be disorderly. It's to be orderly. It's to dress becoming, okay? And then he gives us this. He says, dress in modest apparel. That's not just one term. That's actually 2 concepts. Because apparel is the Greek word katastole. There's something very important here. Katastole. Paul says you need to wear the katastole, a long flowing garment. The Greeks called it katastola. Now, look right up here. The Greeks wore this garment that covered from the neck to below the knees. It had sleeves and it was loose fitting. And Paul said, in the New Testament now, wear the katastola. Women should wear the katastola. They should wear a garment like that. Think with me. Where did we see that before? Paul is telling the New Testament church women thousands of years after Genesis to wear the same garment that God said in Genesis chapter 3 was modest apparel. You know why? Because God's standard of modest apparel hasn't changed from Genesis all the way up through to where we get it here in the New Testament, and it hasn't changed from the New Testament all the way up through to today. God's standard of modest apparel doesn't change. So Paul is requiring the same kind of garment as for a modest woman as God required in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3. And that is where we get it, ladies. We didn't get it from some people in the United States that got together in a committee and then sent all over the world and said, all the United Pentecostal churches around the world that are in fellowship, they need to all dress the same way. That is not where we got this. We got this from the Bible. So the garment of a woman needs to cover her thigh and down to her knee. It doesn't have to be down to her feet. Now, if you like wearing a garment that scrapes the ground, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I've seen people that do. That's fine. In fact, there was a style, there was a period in North America where many of the women wore what they called maxi dresses. And they went right down to the floor. It wasn't mini skirts, it was maxi skirts. And they went all the way down to the floor. God doesn't say that you have to wear that. Now, He could have, because that word is in the Bible. That word is poderes. And we see it in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 13 when John sees Jesus and he's clothed with a garment down to his feet. So that word's in the Scripture. And if Paul wanted to tell us that a modest garment for a